I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 14, Late Awakening. And this is the second part. By mid-1953, Ellen was coming to Isaiah's rooms at All Souls almost every day to work with him on a French translation of The Hedgehog and the Fox. And just in the process of appearing in the Wandenfeld and the Nicholson edition, Wandenfeld had been shrewd enough to see the commercial potential locked up in the obscure essay, Lev Tolstoy's Historical Skepticism, which Isaiah had published in Oxford Slavonic Papers in 1951. By retitling it The Hedgehog and the Fox, and putting it out for a general readership with additions by Isaiah. Wandenfeld did more for Isaiah's public reputation than any other publisher. The essay concluded with the most memorable image of a human anguish in Berlin's writings. It's a picture of a Tolstoy at Astapro. Quote, "At once insanely proud and filled with a hatred, omniscient and doubting everything, cold and violently passionate, contemptuous and self-abasing, tormented and detached, surrounded by an adoring family, by devoted followers, by the admiration of the entire civilized world, and yet almost wholly isolated. He is the most tragic of the great writers, a desperate old man, beyond human aid, wandering self-blinded at Kronos." End quote. As Ellen and Isaiah worked together on the translation of this, the most compelling of all his essays, they came still closer together. He was spontaneous and phenomenally agile of a mind, but also affectionate and full of life. She felt that early death of her sister, her husband, and a brother who died as a young conscript before the war, had left her frozen. Isaiah seemed capable of thawing her out. But still, she could see how different they were. Despite a common Jewishness, she was Parisian French and aristocratic, he a Russian Jew from the commercial classes. As she once said, "I was Western Europe, he was Eastern Europe." Berlin could sense that she was withdrawn, that she had developed a protective shell. He called her the odalisque, ambiguous compliment, which praised her beauty while expressing perplexity at her melancholy passivity. As he wrote to a friend, "I like her very much. She is beautifully bred and altogether charming, and lives in a curiously detached way in Oxford, to which she does not belong in any sense, and which she reacts to in a half-sleep-walking fashion." In the summer of 1953, Isaiah's father was diagnosed with leukemia. The nature of his illness was kept from him by his doctors, but Isaiah was told the truth. In September, he left for a semester at Harvard, knowing that his father was unlikely to recover. Isaiah had always believed that truth entailed certain obligations, and that a dying man was entitled to know the reality of his situation. But now, face to face with his own father, he found it impossible to live up to his own maxims. He arrived home in December to find his father in hospital, alert and without pain, but clearly dying. They spent 2 days together, his father still not exactly aware of his condition, asking his son whether there was an afterlife, and his son not having the heart to tell him that he believed there was no such thing. Mendel met his death with the same gentle, retiring, and slightly baffled air with which he had dealt with life. He slipped into a coma and died in his sleep on 15th December 1953, aged 70. For a week or so, the Jewish rituals of burial and mourning kept both Isaiah and his mother occupied, and Isaiah remarked to a friend about the hidden wisdom of a religion in which he himself did not believe. But thereafter, in January and February, the full force of loss began to hit him. He may not have believed in the rituals, but he followed them punctiliously, ordering services to be held on every anniversary of his father's death. Throughout the winter of 1954, he found it hard to look at his father's handwriting without being overcome by sorrow and a certain remorse. As he remarked sadly to his friend, Anna Kalin, he had always thought of his father as a kind of a younger brother, whom he had to teach about life. Now he understood that his father had sheltered him, taken the responsibilities on his shoulders, allowed Isaiah to remain the untroubled adolescent. For the first time, he realized he was in the front line, responsible for his mother, for himself, for his own life at last. The abnormality and bleakness of this depressed him deeply. Altogether, his father's death had a far deeper and more devastating effect on him than he had expected. It was the most serious emotional crisis of his life. He was deeply depressed throughout the winter of 1954, but he did not turn in upon himself. He poured out his feelings in letters to friends and reached out to Ellen. Before Easter 1954, in a depressed and anguished state of mind, he asked Ellen to give him a lift into London so that he could attend a meeting about the disposal of his father's Brussels business. On the journey, he declared himself and touched her hand. She kept entirely silent throughout, but remembered thinking, "Damn." His touch moved her, but it was deeply unwelcome. She was a married woman with 3 children, struggling to maintain the facade of a difficult marriage. But her unhappiness was such that she began to see him clandestinely. At Easter, they had an hour-long conversation on the phone. Isaiah went on to stay with his mother at the Hotel Rua in Nice. There, he received a letter from Ellen breaking off their relations. Hans Hauben had overheard their conversation and threatened to divorce her and take the children. For 2 days, Isaiah was prostrated, unable to get out of bed. On his return to Oxford, she telephoned him in a strangled voice and invited him to drinks at Haddington House, the splendid 3-story Georgian house she had purchased for her family. It was her husband's idea to keep on good terms. Hauben seems to have thought it impolitic to force the issue to a break. Both Berlin and Hauben were Oxford figures. The matter had to be handled with delicacy. But by then, Isaiah cordially disliked him. But Hans Hauben was also suffering greatly. He had intercepted their phone calls. He employed private detective to track their movements, and once, on Dewell Beach, Allen found him frantically piecing together a letter of Isaiah's that she had read and torn up. His anguish was unmistakable. At the drinks party, Allen appeared, drained and miserable, while Isaiah kept his distance from her and maintained a stilted conversation with Hauben. Soon afterwards, Allen phoned and said that she must see him. "I'm a prisoner," she said. "Will you take me in?" They began meeting again in the summer of 1954, driving out into the country together. But one day, having arranged to meet her in the high street opposite All Souls, Berlin crossed a road only to see that Hauben had got word of the rendezvous and had come to confront them both. Isaiah continued across the street, bowed to both of them, went into the chemist's directly opposite, blindly purchased items he did not need, and returned to his rooms in All Souls, feeling, so he remembered, more dead than alive. Soon afterwards, Hauben called and asked Isaiah to come to Huntington House for a meeting. As Isaiah remembered, Hauben said, "This is a difficult situation. Let's talk about it." But it was Isaiah who did the talking. He remembered saying, "Look, you are entirely right. Justice is entirely on your side. You are married to her. You love her. There is nothing I can say. I fully understand your position. You needn't expound it to me. There is only one thing I would like to say. Let me give you a piece of advice. It's not entirely unbiased, as you will see. If you keep someone in prison, the prisoner is more anxious to get out than the jailer is to keep her in. This will not end well. If you stop her from seeing me, this will not go on indefinitely. Sooner or later, it's bound to be broken, even if I do nothing at all." This urban disquisition on the psychology of freedom appears to have taken Hauben by surprise. He said he would think about it and sent Isaiah into the garden to see Allen. She was wandering to and fro amidst the roses, twisting a handkerchief in her hand. She was just telling Isaiah that she felt sorry for her husband when Hauben rushed into the garden with a note. It read, "I accept your proposal. You may see her once a week." It was a desperate measure. The marriage was like a cracked vase. But Isaiah, too, was giving way under the strain. By this time, he wanted Allen desperately, but she continued to feel tormented by residual loyalty to her husband and anxiety about the impact upon the children. In late autumn, Isaiah was hospitalized with pericarditis, irregularity of the heartbeat, which left him dizzy and breathless. It was an obvious symptom of emotional exhaustion. At the end of 1954, Hans Hauben was approached by the French government and asked to return to Paris to head up a new nuclear physics laboratory. When he proposed to Allen that they accept, she said she could not accompany him. This was the end of the marriage. Isaiah was standing in the porter's lodge at All Souls, talking to a friend when Allen ran through with the news. It was over. Hauben had left for Paris. He had agreed to a separation. 2 weeks later, in Oxford Botanical Garden, he proposed marriage. To his dismay, she wondered why it was necessary. He persisted. He wanted something solid and definite. She relented, and they announced their engagement. Isaiah presented Ellen to his mother, who, having been alarmed at the head of his infatuation with Patricia Douglas, that he might marry a Gentile, was now overjoyed that he was returning to the fold. Whatever ambivalence a powerful, protective mother would have had towards a protective daughter-in-law, this was balanced by pride that her family should be marrying into the Der Gansberg family, whom all Russian Jews had respected for their philanthropy. She told a friend that she had trained herself to be parted from Isaiah, and while marriage was a deeper and much more definite parting, she hoped by practicing a self-imposed discipline and not interfering in his life to gain Ellen's devotion. Ellen's mother, a grand dame of great vigor and charm, had met Isaiah and liked him, but when her daughter broke the news of their impending marriage, she exclaimed, "Merely impossible." Almost all of Isaiah's friends, male and female, registered the same surprise. He was the least marriageable man they knew. The news that they were to be married, once the divorce was finalized in Paris, filtered down to Isaiah's friends through the winter and spring of 1955. But there was still one person who knew nothing. The woman he had been in love with 2 years before chanced to hear the news from a mutual friend at All Souls lunch following the conferring of honorary degrees in June 1955. Her shock and disappointment were intense. She came to Isaiah's rooms, and he could only comfort her at best he could. "Cry, child, cry." It is a testament to her lack of rancor, the depth of his attachment, and Ellen's forbearance, that they remained close friends, mocking each other's politics and exchanging confessions throughout the rest of Isaiah's life. In the summer of 1955, Ellen and Isaiah journeyed through the south of France together, traveling as a man and a wife. But by then, both felt that they had never been so much in love in their lives. It seemed a revelation to Ellen that this middle-aged bachelor, so notoriously inexposable, should have been able to thaw her out and restore her animation, confidence, and appetite for life. They had already developed a running joke about the French, with Ellen defending the country of her birth, its culture and civilization, and Isaiah grumbling that they measured out their emotions by the thimbleful. While staying in Avignon, they went to see the art collector Douglas Cooper at his chateau in the Vaucluse. They lunched in company with Cooper and the philosopher Richard Wilhelm and his wife Anne. Isaiah told a long story about the death of the Spanish poet Lope de Vega. Assured that he was now finally at death's door, de Vega was able to confess one final, sacrilegious thought: "Alors, Dante men embêtit," meaning, "Well then, Dante bores me." This caused much laughter at lunch. Afterwards, Cooper and Wilhelm went off to a bullfight at Nimes, where Cooper was to meet Pablo Picasso. Alan and Isaiah returned in the evening to find Cooper's chateau ablaze with light and servants scurrying to and fro. In the forecourt was an enormous Mercedes. Inside, they found Pablo Picasso, his mistress Jacqueline, his son Paulo, Jean Cocteau, the artist Teresa, and his mistress. Picasso and Wilhelm went upstairs into the attic to look at an early still life which Cooper had just bought. Picasso had not seen it since he had painted it. He bent over the picture, stood back, and then muttered, "C'est bizarre, c'est quelle chose." After dinner, Picasso talked amusingly about how it was that, whenever he was invited to Moscow and proposed an exhibition of his own work, the invitation was mysteriously withdrawn. Isaiah was always drawn to genius, and such was the force of Picasso's personality that he was uncharacteristically silent throughout dinner. Picasso was about to leave when Isaiah approached and began telling him the story of Lope de Vega's dying words. The result was disastrous. As Isaiah plugged on, Picasso's face darkened with displeasure. Death was a strictly forbidden subject in Picasso's presence. A story about the death of a famous Spaniard was worse, and the worst of all was a story in which a Spanish artist's dying words were held up to apparent ridicule. Picasso stormed out, and the huge Mercedes rolled off into the night. Isaiah remained at a loss to understand what he had done wrong. For once in his life, his uncanny social antennae had failed him. His uncharacteristic obliviousness has to be seen as the exaltation of a man deeply in love. As Alan and Isaiah continued through France to Rome, where Isaiah was to attend a historians' conference, he wrote an ecstatic letter to his mother saying, "I'm about 30 years younger than I had ever been." This state of happiness continued as they drove south into Italy. When they sent telegrams to France or signed joint letters, they ornamented their name, Isaiah Allen. In Rome, Isaiah met the first Soviet historian allowed out of Russia since Stalin's death. The Khrushchev thaw was just getting underway, and many Western observers thought a genuinely new era had dawned. Isaiah remained skeptical. When Isaac Deutscher announced in the Times that the Asian regime was mellowing, Berlin thought the argument was clever rubbish. As he reported to his mother, the Soviet historians were full of hearty bohemian, but it all seemed like a performance, carefully orchestrated by their party bosses. His own analysis of Soviet politics, Generalissimo Stalin and the art of government, had outlined the zigzag pattern of Soviet behavior, now loosening, now tightening the reins of repression in order to keep their enemies off balance. The new thought was a zigzag in the pattern. A zag was sure to follow shortly. He spent the autumn of 1955 lecturing at the University of Chicago. He met the conservative political philosopher Leo Strauss, and they talked about Hobbes and Machiavelli. Strauss was one of those who remained skeptical both about Berlin's scholarship and about his liberal project in general. Through Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Berlin made the acquaintance of L.D. Stevenson, former governor of Illinois and Democratic candidate for president. Unlike most intellectuals, who admired Stevenson this side of idolatry, Berlin was unimpressed. He thought Stevenson was neither a genuine intellectual nor a genuine man of action, and he was always most admiring of politicians like Truman or Weizmann, who were men of action. Like a star tenor, Isaiah was now drawing large crowds, and American universities made flattering offers, but his attention was elsewhere. The absence from Ellen was painful. She was in Oxford and Paris finalizing the divorce, but it gave them both time and space to reflect on each other. To his mother, Isaiah confided that 1955 had been the most triumphant year of his life. I'm happily in love. It is an astonishing sensation to live on a perpetually rising wave of a very strong, very calm, very real emotion as a luxury not known to me before. In a letter to Ellen, he struck note of alarm, partly genuine, partly ironic, about his approaching loss of independence. He also commented in a jocular way about the submerged connection between the dramas in his personal life and the development of his political ideas. Quote, "It is a far stronger transformation of my life than of yours. Still 45, I lived without knowing this sensation of irrecoverable loss of independence. I'm trying to write notes for politics lectures on why people think a feeling of necessity is a freedom. I'm certainly tied hand and foot. Am I unfree? Is this what political love for leaders produces? Is fanatical devotion, violent love, self-realization, or is there some calm, deep feeling which is not tied to images and it goes on in some even mysterious fashion?" He could now look back on a decade that had elapsed since his return from Washington as the most transforming period of his life. He had left analytical philosophy and found his own voice as a historian and a moralist. He had faced up to the conflicting claims that threatened to divide him as a Zionist and as a Jew, and he had resolved his position in the diaspora. He had been tempted by America and had overcome it. His liberalism was always to have a different inflection from theirs. Finally, he had overcome his emotional hesitations and was about to embark on a married life. He joked to a friend that if he had to write an autobiography, he would call it a late awakening. But a week he had, all of these struggles for the identity as a Jew, an intellectual, a liberal, and a man had converged simultaneously, and after his moment, he emerged with the work that was to make him famous and with the woman who was to share the rest of his life. On 7 February 1956, at the Hampstead Synagogue, he and Ellen were married. 3 days later, he moved into Haddington House, where he lived for the rest of his life.